Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight, in our Figures series, we bring you a story not of power or politics, but of a fragile woman in a white sari who carried the world's suffering on her shoulders. In today's Figures story, we enter the hidden struggles of Mother Teresa, the woman the world praised as a living saint, yet who quietly battled loneliness, doubts, and silence from heaven itself. When most people think of Mother Teresa, they imagine the smiling nun holding dying children, whispering prayers over the sick, and receiving awards from kings and presidents. But what they don't know is this: behind those lined cheeks and folded hands was a heart that often felt abandoned by God. Her letters, revealed after her death, showed decades of torment, a soul dry, a faith tested, a woman questioning why heaven stayed silent when the cries of the poor were so loud. But why? Why would God allow such a servant to feel so alone? And how could this hidden suffering shape the choices she made, choices that would forever change the streets of Calcutta and the conscience of the world? Before the fame, before the Nobel Prize, before the image of her face became a global symbol of compassion, she was simply a young girl in Albania named Angeze. She was small, shy, and born into a devout Catholic family. Her father died when she was still a child, a loss that imprinted on her the shadow of suffering. Her mother, a strong and prayerful woman, taught her that the poor were not to be pitied but honored. "My child," she would whisper, "never eat a mouthful unless you share it with someone else." That seed of sacrifice grew quietly. By the age of 12, Teresa, as she would later be called, felt the first tug of something deeper. She dreamed of faraway lands of service, of giving her life not to comfort, but to suffering itself. Yet even then, she wrestled with a terrifying question: what if God asked too much of her? Years later, when she left her home forever at just 18 to join the Sisters of Loreto, her heart carried both excitement and dread. She boarded a train to Ireland, tears burning in her eyes as her mother's figure grew smaller at the station. She would never see her family again. That was the cost of her yes. But could a young woman truly grasp what such a sacrifice meant? Did she know she was leaving not just her family, but also the warmth of familiarity, the security of being known? Or did she believe, as many of us do when we take the first step of faith, that God's plan would always feel clear, luminous, and filled with joy? If she thought so, she was wrong. For what awaited her was not light, but shadow. In Calcutta, where the heat pressed like a weight and the smell of decay rose from every street corner, she would face the greatest test of her life. She would walk past bodies left unclaimed, children crying out of hunger, and the sick abandoned by their families. She felt an ache inside her, not of disgust, but of helplessness. She wanted to hold them all. She wanted to wipe every brow, lift every child, kiss every wound. But she was just one woman, and late at night, when her hands were empty, she would fall to her knees and whisper, "God, where are you? Why do you stay silent when I need you most?" Little did she know, the silence would last for years, and yet it was in that silence that her true mission was about to be born. But what exactly was it that she heard in the slums that night? A whisper so strong it changed her entire destiny. And was it truly her own voice or God's? She didn't know then, but that moment would divide her life into two halves, before and after. The convent life was quiet, orderly, almost predictable. Teaching at the Loreto School in Calcutta, Sister Teresa wore the black habit of her order, spoke to children in gentle tones, and guided them through their lessons. To many, it seemed like a peaceful calling, a life of devotion, teaching, and prayer. But beneath that calm surface, something was stirring, something restless. Each day, as her students scribbled words on chalkboards, Teresa's eyes were drawn not to their neat faces, but to the window. Outside, the streets of Calcutta throbbed with another world, a world of crippling poverty, hunger, and despair. She saw children the same age as her students, scavenging in the trash. She heard the cries of the dying on street corners, ignored by passers-by, and she felt her soul pulled toward them, as if invisible hands were guiding her beyond the convent walls. But how could she leave? She had taken vows. She had given her life to the Sisters of Loreto. To step away would mean breaking the order, disobeying her superiors. Could it really be God who was asking her to do this? Or was it her own restless heart? In September 1946, during a train ride to Darjeeling, her answer came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't thunder. It was a whisper, soft and relentless, echoing in her soul, "I thirst." It was the cry of Jesus from the cross. But for her, it was also the cry of the streets of Calcutta, the cry of every child abandoned, every mother dying without comfort, every man left to rot on the pavement. Teresa later called it the call within the call. It wasn't just a summons to serve. It was a command to leave behind everything she had built and walk into the slums with nothing but faith. But could she obey? Could she trade the security of convent walls for the filth of Calcutta's gutters? Could she risk her own health, her own soul, to embrace the rejected and the forgotten? That night she prayed with tears, and she made a decision that would shock her sisters and forever change her fate. She would leave, not leave God, not leave her vows, but leave the safety of Loreto to become, as she put it, free to serve the poorest of the poor. Still, her decision came at a price. For nearly 2 years, she waited, waiting for the church to approve her request, waiting for permission to walk out of the convent gates. It was agony. She lived in the convent, but her heart was already in the streets. Finally, in 1948, she was released. She exchanged the black habit for a simple white sari with blue stripes, the garment that would one day become a global symbol. She carried only a rosary, a few supplies, and a heart ready to break. Her first steps into the slums were terrifying. The air was heavy with sickness. The ground was littered with waste. Flies buzzed around the dying. She bent to lift a woman's head from the dirt, but the woman's eyes were clouded with fear. No one had ever touched her with kindness, and Teresa realized something piercing. It wasn't just food or medicine the poor craved. It was dignity. It was love. But how do you give love when you have nothing? How do you feed the hungry when your own stomach aches? She didn't know, yet. She only knew one thing. If this was where God wanted her, then He would provide. But in those first days, it didn't feel like heaven was providing. It felt like silence. The streets were overwhelming. The needs were endless, and she was one woman alone. Late at night, she would return to her small rented room, collapse onto the floor, and whisper into the darkness, "Jesus, you said, I thirst, but I am thirsting too. Why do you hide?" Still, she rose the next morning and returned to the streets. Day after day, her steps became heavier, her prayers more desperate. Until one day, a child tugged at her sari. His face was hollow, his body thin. He looked at her with eyes that asked nothing and everything at once. And in that moment, she felt it. The silence broke. Not with words, but with presence. God was not absent. He was in the child, waiting to be seen. But could she sustain this? Could one woman's faith survive in a sea of suffering that never ended? Or would the silence of heaven swallow her whole? She didn't know then, but the battle between despair and devotion would mark every step of her journey ahead. By the late 1940s, Calcutta was a city of contrasts. The wealthy lived in grand homes, sipping tea on shaded verandas, while only streets away the poor lay dying in the open. India had just won its independence, but freedom had not freed the hungry stomachs in the slums. Famine and disease stalked every corner. Mother Teresa walked those streets daily, clothed in her simple sari, carrying no wealth, no possessions, only her determination to love. But even love needs a vessel. Even love must find a home. So she began with nothing: a borrowed room, a table, a chair, and her own 2 hands. This was her first school for slum children. She had no chalkboard, no textbooks, no desks. She drew letters in the dust with a stick. She sang lessons with her students in the open air. And when people mocked her, "How can dust be a school?" she answered with a calm that masked her exhaustion. Where love is, there is school. But her true test came not with children, but with the dying. One evening, she found a woman collapsed on the street, covered in sores, eaten by rats. The crowd stepped over her. Teresa knelt. She tried to lift the woman, but the smell of death was suffocating. Her stomach churned, her hands trembled, and for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Could she really do this? Could she love this much? She carried the woman to a hospital. But the nurses refused her. "We have no bed for her," they said. Teresa begged, but they turned her away. Standing outside with the dying woman in her arms, Teresa whispered in fury and despair, "Lord, you asked me to do this, but you give me nowhere to take her." That night she resolved, if no one else would open their doors, she would. And so, the first home of the dying was born. It was nothing more than a crumbling building near the Temple of Kali, lent to her by the city. There were no supplies, no equipment, just mats on the floor. But it was enough. She washed wounds, gave medicine, whispered prayers. She cradled the forgotten, holding them until death claimed them. Critics rose quickly. Some accused her of doing little more than offering comfort while people still died. Others accused her of converting Hindus to Christianity. She felt the sting of these words deeply, yet she pressed on, because for her, the mission was never about numbers or statistics. It was about one person at a time. She would later say, "If I look at the masses, I will never act. If I look at one, I will." But the strain was heavy. She was still alone. The cries of the dying filled her ears. The weight of their pain pressed on her chest. Some nights, she lay awake trembling, haunted by images of suffering. In her letters, she confessed, "There is such terrible darkness within me, as if everything is dead. I do not feel God. I do not hear him." What kind of saint writes such words? And yet, wasn't it precisely in this honesty that her greatness lay? She was not a woman who lived on endless consolations. She was a woman who loved even when her own soul was dry. Still, she could not go on alone forever. She needed help. She needed others to see what she saw. And then, the first miracle of her mission arrived. A young girl, once her student, came to her. "Mother, I want to help." Soon, another joined. Then, another. Within months, a small band of women in white saris walked the streets beside her, gathering the sick, feeding the hungry, teaching the forgotten. The missionaries of charity had been born, not through grand speeches or wealthy donors, but through the steady glow of one woman's stubborn faith. But could this fragile flame survive the storms ahead? For not everyone welcomed her mission. In the shadows, criticism grew louder, and her own soul slipped deeper into silence. She didn't know it yet, but the next battle would not be with poverty alone, but with her own aching emptiness. The little band of sisters in white saris moved like whispers through the alleys of Calcutta. They carried stretchers for the dying, bowls of rice for the hungry, and notebooks for children with no school. Their numbers were small, their resources even smaller, but their presence became impossible to ignore. Neighbors began to notice. Newspapers began to write. Soon, the story of the nun who had left everything to serve the poorest of the poor spread beyond India. Journalists called her the saint of the gutters. Politicians invited her to speak. Donors sent money from abroad. It seemed like triumph. The flame had become a fire. But fame is never simple. For every admirer, there was a critic. Some accused her of glorifying suffering instead of fighting to end it. Others whispered she was only seeking converts, using food as bait for religion. She denied these accusations, but their sting followed her. And still, through it all, she smiled. That small, wrinkled smile that would one day circle the globe. But behind that smile was a secret she revealed only in letters to her confessors, sealed away from the world until after her death. Her words were haunting. The place of God in my soul is blank. I feel nothing. I pray, but the silence is so great. I look and do not see. I listen and do not hear. How could it be? How could the woman the world saw as God's closest servant feel abandoned by him? How could she cradle the dying with such tenderness, while her own soul ached with emptiness? And yet, that was her reality. For nearly 50 years, she endured what theologians call the dark night of the soul. Every morning she rose before dawn, whispered prayers into the silence, and walked into the slums. She clothed the poor, kissed the sick, fed the hungry. She did all the things love demanded, and yet, inside, she felt nothing but dryness, as if God had turned his face away. But maybe that was the mystery. Maybe her greatness was not that she felt God's presence, but that she loved him when he seemed absent. Maybe holiness was not about endless light, but about choosing love in endless darkness. Still, the silence pressed hard. At times, she wrote that she feared it would break her. In my soul, there is only pain. I have no faith. I do not believe then. Almost in the same breath, she would add, and yet, I will not quit. I belong to him, even if he does not want me. What kind of courage is that? To serve a God you cannot feel. To live a faith that feels like ashes. And what does it say about us, who sometimes mistake comfort for closeness? The world, of course, saw none of this. They saw the Nobel Prize in 1979, the standing ovations, the photographs of her shaking hands with presidents and popes. They saw a tiny woman whose shadow stretched across nations. But in her letters, she described herself differently. A smile is a mask I wear. Behind it, the pain of loss. I smile to hide what is within. Was that deception, or was it sacrifice? The sacrifice of her own consolation so that others might see hope. The missionaries of charity grew beyond her imagination. Houses opened not just in India, but around the world. In New York, in Africa, in Rome. Thousands of sisters took vows to live as she lived. Poor, humble, obedient, and dedicated to the unwanted. And yet, in the quiet of the night, when the applause faded and the lights dimmed, she returned to the same whisper, Lord, where are you? Why are you silent? Still, she did not stop. She could not, because in the eyes of the poor, she saw him. And maybe that was the lesson, that even when heaven seems silent, God is not gone. He is hidden, waiting in the faces we are most tempted to ignore. But how long could her body, frail and aging, bear the weight of so many? And would the silence of God ever lift before her death? She did not know then. But the final chapters of her life would test not just her soul, but her very flesh. By the 1980s, Mother Teresa's name was spoken in every corner of the globe. Presidents sought her counsel. Celebrities bent at her feet. Children wrote letters calling her a hero. Her wrinkled face, framed in the white and blue sari, had become the very image of mercy. But saints too grow old. Her body, once light and quick, began to betray her. The years of bending over cots, lifting the sick, walking through alleys, had worn her down. She suffered from heart trouble. She collapsed during travels. There were whispers that she would not live long enough to guide the order she had birthed. Doctors urged her to rest. Sisters begged her to slow down. But she refused. Rest, she said, is a luxury the poor cannot afford. If they have no rest, neither will I. Still, every step cost her. The smile remained, but her legs trembled. Her voice grew thinner. She would often steady herself on a wall before entering a room, so no one would see her weakness. Yet even as her body weakened, her influence soared. She spoke at the United Nations, pleading for peace. She stood before Congress, reminding them that poverty was not only in distant nations, but in their own streets. She called abortion the greatest destroyer of peace, a statement that stirred both admiration and outrage. But here was the paradox. The world saw a lioness of faith, while within, she still felt the hollow ache of silence. In her private letters, she confessed that the dryness had not lifted. "I feel only darkness. The place of God is empty. I long for him, yet he does not come." Why would God allow such a thing? Why let his servant walk for decades without the warmth of his presence? Was it punishment? Or was it, as some theologians later suggested, that he allowed her to drink, in her own soul, a small share of the same abandonment Christ felt on the cross? Whatever the reason, she endured it with a strange kind of stubbornness. She clung to prayer not because she felt it, but because she refused to let go. "When I cannot pray," she said, "I will at least try to speak." Her sisters noticed her weariness. Some whispered to one another, "Is Mother suffering? Does she doubt?" They never imagined the depth of her torment, and she never told them. She wanted them to see her smile, not her struggle. But struggle it was. Some nights she wept alone. Some mornings she rose from her bed with a heart that felt like stone. And still she went out, to wash, to feed, to embrace. What drove her? Perhaps it was this conviction, that love is not a feeling but an action. And if God was silent, then she would become his voice for those who could not speak. But time pressed on, and her frail body could no longer keep pace with her fiery will. Heart attacks came. Hospital stays followed. By the 1990s, the missionaries of charity had grown to thousands, across dozens of countries. Yet the woman who had birthed it all struggled to climb stairs without pain. And still, she refused to stop. In 1997, at 87 years old, she was seen in the slums once again, holding a dying child, her lips whispering prayers. What kind of strength is this? To rise from a hospital bed and walk back into the gutters? To continue pouring from an empty cup? But the truth is, her cup was never empty. It was being filled unseen by the same God she thought absent. And though she could not feel it, the world could. Her very emptiness became the space through which his love poured out. Still, one question lingered. Would she die still longing, still thirsting for a God she could not feel? Or, in her final hours, would the silence break at last? She did not know, but the answer would come on the day her wrinkled hands finally stilled. By the mid-1990s, Mother Teresa was no longer just a figure of faith. She was a global symbol. Presidents bowed their heads when she entered the room. Journalists followed her every step. Her order stretched across continents, with thousands of sisters serving the forgotten in more than 100 countries. But the woman at the heart of it all was fading. Her health crumbled under the weight of her years. She suffered multiple heart attacks. Breathing became difficult. Doctors urged her to retire, to let others carry the mission. But retirement was not a word she understood. Even as her body weakened, she clung to the streets of Calcutta, where her mission had begun. The sisters begged her, "Mother, rest." She answered softly, "How can I rest when the poor have no rest? How can I stop while there is still one person unloved?" Still, the toll was visible. In her final public appearances, she leaned heavily on others for support. Her voice cracked, her frame seemed smaller, her steps slower. Yet her eyes, those piercing eyes, never lost their fire. In March of 1997, she handed over the leadership of the Missionaries of Charity. For the first time in half a century, she was no longer the head of the order she had birthed. It was an act of humility, a surrender of control that mirrored the surrender she had made decades before when she left Laredo. And then, on September 5th, 1997, in the same city where she had given everything, her journey ended. Calcutta fell silent. Crowds gathered in the streets. Thousands wept openly. Hindus, Muslims, Christians alike. The Indian government gave her a state funeral, an honor rarely bestowed on a foreign-born nun. Her coffin, draped in the blue and white of her sari, was carried through the city she loved. The poor, the very people she had cradled in her arms, lined the streets to say goodbye. Yet even in death, the mystery of her life lingered. Her letters, made public after her passing, revealed a woman who had lived decades in spiritual darkness. a woman who smiled while her soul cried, a woman who comforted others while she herself felt no comfort from heaven. For some, it was shocking. How could the saint of Calcutta have doubted God? But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps holiness is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to love anyway. Perhaps her greatest miracle was not the houses she built or the prizes she won, but the simple fact that she remained faithful when faith felt impossible. The years after her death only deepened her legacy. In 2003, Pope John Paul II beatified her, calling her Blessed Teresa of Calcutta. And in 2016, she was canonized a saint by Pope Francis. The woman who had walked in silence was lifted up as one of the great lights of the modern age. And yet, in the quiet reflection of those who knew her best, it was not her titles or honors that mattered. It was her eyes, her touch, her presence. It was the way she bent to cradle the dying as if they were kings, the way she smiled at children as if they were princes, the way she turned every alley into a sanctuary. Still, her life raises questions that echo today. How do we love when we feel nothing in return? How do we keep faith when heaven seems silent? And do we always recognize God even when he comes disguised in rags and sickness? Mother Teresa never found easy answers. She simply kept walking, kept loving, kept giving, until her frail heart gave out. And maybe that is her true lesson, that the measure of a life is not in how much light we feel, but in how much light we give. She was gone, yet the flame she lit in the darkest slums still burns. In every sister who wears her sari, in every hand that touches the poor, and in every heart that chooses love over despair. Death did not silence the name of Mother Teresa. If anything, it amplified it. Almost immediately after her funeral, the world began to debate her legacy. Some raised her as the purest saint of the modern era. Others whispered questions, even accusations. And in that clash of voices, her story took on a new life. The critics pointed sharply. They said her homes for the dying were too simple, that they offered comfort, but little real medical treatment. They accused her of embracing suffering instead of fighting to end it. They argued that her refusal to align with politics, her rejection of wealth for systemic change, left poverty untouched. Others dug deeper, pointing to her friendships with powerful leaders, some of them corrupt. They asked, why would she accept donations from tainted hands? Why stand beside dictators or businessmen who exploited others? The questions multiplied. The saint of the gutters became, in some corners, a figure of suspicion. And yet, for every critic, there were thousands of voices who rose to defend her. They were not politicians or journalists. They were the men and women she had touched, literally touched, in their last hours. They were the children who had eaten their first meal in her homes. They were the orphans who had found sisters to raise them. They were the poor of Calcutta, who knew her not as an icon or a Nobel laureate, but simply as Mother. One dying man, cradled by her sisters, whispered words that outlived his breath. For the first time, I feel human. Was that not medicine too? Was that not healing? And what of those controversial donations? Teresa herself once said, I accept money from anyone. The poor have no time to ask if their bread is pure. To her, the moral burden of wealth lay on the giver. Her task was to transform it into love. But perhaps the greatest revelation came not from her critics, nor her defenders, but from her own hidden letters. When the world discovered her decades of spiritual darkness, some were scandalized. How could a saint doubt God, they asked. Yet others saw it as her most profound witness. For what is faith, if not holding on when every feeling tells you to let go? What is love, if not giving when you feel empty? In that sense, her silence was not weakness. It was strength, a furnace that burned her soul down to pure fidelity. She became, in her hidden suffering, closer to Christ than many realized. Just as he cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? So too did she. And maybe that was her greatest gift. She showed us that even saints are not spared the silence of God. She showed us that holiness is not about comfort, but courage. Not about certainty, but surrender. Today, her name remains one of the most recognized in the world. Schools, hospitals, and charities bear it. Her face, lined and small, appears on murals and stamps. And her sisters, in their white saris with blue stripes, still walk the streets of the forgotten, whispering prayers over the dying. But her legacy is not in the statues or the honors. It is in the quiet act of kneeling beside someone the world has thrown away and saying, "You are loved." Still, the questions linger. Do we honor the poor by easing their pain or by changing the world that made them poor? Do we measure holiness by success or by sacrifice? And do we dare to follow a God who sometimes seems silent, trusting that silence itself might be part of his voice? Mother Teresa never answered these questions fully. She lived them, and in doing so, she left us a mirror to face our own. Her life was a paradox, her legacy a mystery, but her love undeniable. After her death, the missionaries of charity faced a daunting question. Could they carry her work without her presence? Could the flame she lit continue to burn without the small, wrinkled woman who had been its heart? At first, many feared the order would weaken. How could thousands of sisters, spread across the globe, hold together without the woman whose very gaze seemed to keep them steady? But something unexpected happened. Instead of shrinking, the missionaries of charity grew. New vocations came, new houses opened, and in every corner of the world, from Harlem to Haiti, from Africa to the war-torn Balkans, women in white saris continued bending over the poor, whispering the same words she had spoken, "You are loved." It was proof of something Mother Teresa had often repeated. It is not my work, it is his. Yet the release of her letters added a new dimension to her story. For decades, she had hidden her inner torment, the silence of God that weighed on her soul. When those words came to light, many were shaken. Could the saint of the poor really have felt abandoned by heaven? Theologians began to study her letters with awe. Some said her spiritual darkness was not a weakness, but a rare gift, a sharing in the thirst of Christ on the cross. Others saw it as the ultimate form of solidarity. Just as she walked into the slums to share in the suffering of the poor, so too did she walk into the slums of the soul, to share in the poverty of those who feel God is absent. Her darkness became, in a strange way, her most powerful testimony, because who among us has not prayed and felt only silence? Who has not longed for God and heard nothing in return? And yet, who among us has loved as she did in that silence? Maybe that was the hidden twist of her life. The saint who seemed to walk closest to God actually lived in his shadow, so that she might teach us how to walk there too. Her sisters testify to it even now. They say that when they feel weary, they remember her. When they bend over a dying child, when they wash the wounds of a leper, when they whisper prayers over someone abandoned, they hear her voice, "Do it for Jesus. Do it with love." And beyond the convent walls, her story has inspired countless others. Doctors who chose to serve in free clinics, teachers who moved to underserved neighborhoods, families who adopted orphans, young men and women who gave their lives to charity. All of them in some way traced their courage back to a small nun in Calcutta who dared to live love without condition. But the silence she endured also raises haunting questions for us. If Mother Teresa could feel abandoned by God and still keep loving, what excuse do we have when our faith falters? If she could find him in the wrinkled face of a dying stranger, do we miss him in the people sitting right beside us? And most importantly, do we dare to believe that God's silence is not absence, but invitation? Invitation to love without reward. Invitation to trust without proof. Invitation to give, even when we feel empty. Mother Teresa's life was not a story of comfort. It was a story of costly love. And perhaps that is why it speaks so powerfully today. Because in our age of noise and distraction, her silence teaches us something deeper than words ever could. But the question remains, will the world remember her as she truly was, a woman of shadow who chose light, or will it turn her into just another statue, her fire reduced to marble and stone? The answer lies not in her canonization, but in us. For her mission will only live if we choose to live it too. For all the honors, awards, and debates surrounding her, the truest measure of Mother Teresa's life was not written in headlines. It was written in faces. One such face belonged to a boy named Aaron. He had been abandoned on a railway platform, his body twisted by polio, his stomach shriveled by hunger. Passers-by stepped over him, trains thundered past him, and still he lay unnoticed. Until one morning, a small figure in a white sari knelt beside him. She lifted him gently, cradled him as though he were her own child, and whispered, "You are not forgotten." Aaron would later say, "That was the first time I felt human." There was also Fatima, a young mother dying of tuberculosis. She had been left on the side of the road, shunned because her cough terrified her neighbors. When the sisters found her, she was too weak to lift her head. Mother Teresa sat beside her, spooned broth into her mouth and stroked her hair. Fatima whispered through cracked lips, "Why do you care?" "I am nothing." And Teresa answered simply, "To me, you are Jesus." Then there was Joseph, a homeless man who had lived in the filth of Calcutta's alleys for years. When he was brought into the home of the dying, he resisted. He shouted, cursed, spat. He was certain no one could love him. But Teresa herself came to his cot, placed her frail hand on his forehead, and prayed softly until his rage turned to tears. He died 3 days later, but not alone. These stories are not in official records. They are not carved into marble. They live in the memories of those who witnessed them. Small acts of love that became eternal. And yet, each of these moments came at a cost. Because while she poured love into the broken, her own soul remained thirsty. In her letters, she confessed that these faces gave her strength, but they did not lift the silence. She wrote, "I see Jesus in them. But when I close my eyes, I see nothing. I hear nothing. And yet, I must keep going." Perhaps that was the secret of her endurance, that she did not need to feel God to believe in him. She did not need to hear his voice to obey it. She found him again and again in the faces of those who had been cast aside. And isn't that the challenge for us too? To look at the hungry child not as a burden, but as Christ himself? To see in the sick, the lonely, the forgotten, the very face of God. Still, the testimonies of those she touched remain the strongest defense against every critic. They are not theories. They are not debates. They are lives changed by a touch, a word, a smile. One sister recalled the day a child dying of starvation whispered to Teresa, "I am going to heaven to give Jesus your love." For Teresa, that was enough. Not statistics, not applause, just one child carrying love into eternity. And so, though her inner night remained, her outer light only grew brighter. Every life she touched became a spark, spreading her fire into places she herself would never reach. But the deeper question is this: did she realize the magnitude of what she was building? Or did she die believing she had given little, when in truth she had given the world more than it could measure? Perhaps she never knew, but God knew, and that was enough. The year after her death, people across the world spoke of Mother Teresa as if she had been an angel walking among them. Her canonization process began with unusual speed. Within 6 years, she was declared blessed. Within less than 2 decades, she was officially named a saint. Crowds filled St. Peter's Square in Rome, banners of her lined the Vatican, and her face, the face once bent over gutters, shone across giant screens. It was triumph, it was glory, but it was also paradox, because while the world lifted her up as a symbol of certainty, her private letters revealed a soul that had lived in doubt. While the church called her a beacon of faith, her own words confessed, "I feel like an empty shell with nothing inside. How do we reconcile these two Teresas, the public saint and the private struggler? Perhaps the answer is that they were never two at all. They were one and the same. For what made her holy was not the absence of darkness, but her choice to love within it. What made her great was not that she always felt God, but that she always acted as if he were there. And isn't that the essence of faith? To step forward not when the path is lit, but when it is dark? To trust not when you feel comfort, but when you feel nothing at all? In this way, her hidden suffering becomes her most powerful gift to us. Because who among us has not prayed into silence? Who has not looked at life's pain and wondered where God is? And if she could walk through 50 years of silence, yet still cradle the dying and smile at the orphan, then perhaps we too can keep going when God feels far. Her canonization was not the end of her story. It was a doorway. For through it, millions were invited to see that holiness is not perfection. Holiness is persistence. Holiness is love without conditions. Holiness is fidelity in the dark. Her sisters continue her work, moving through cities and slums, caring for those the world rejects. They do not ask if someone is Christian or Hindu, Muslim, or atheist. They ask only, "Are you hungry? Are you sick? Are you alone?" And then they answer with presence. But even her sainthood does not silence the questions. Should more have been done to fight the systems that created poverty? Should her homes have offered more medical treatment? Should she have challenged governments more fiercely? These debates will go on. And maybe that is right, because her story is not meant to give easy answers. It is meant to stir us, unsettle us, push us to wrestle with what love truly means. In the end, her life leaves us standing in the tension between weakness and strength, doubt and faith, silence and love. And in that tension lies the very mystery of God. Still, one final question remains. Did Mother Teresa herself ever feel the silence break before her last breath? Did she glimpse the face she had longed for all her life? Did God, at the final moment, speak into the darkness that had shadowed her soul? We do not know. But perhaps the answer is not for us to know, only to trust that the silence was not the end, but the threshold. When we look back at Mother Teresa's journey, we are tempted to see only the white sari, the gentle smile, the Nobel Prize medal glinting under lights. But to stop there would be to miss the deeper truth. Her greatness did not lie in recognition, but in what she carried unseen: silence, emptiness, and unrelenting faith in the face of it all. It forces us to ask, what is faith really? Is it the warm glow of certainty, or the decision to walk when the road feels endless? Mother Teresa's life suggests an answer. Faith is not feeling, it is fidelity. It is not the absence of darkness, but the refusal to surrender to it. She rose each day not because her soul was full, but because her soul was thirsty. She kept loving, kept giving, kept serving, because she believed that even silence could be holy, if it was offered for God. And that raises the question for us. What do we do when heaven feels silent? Do we stop praying? Do we give up? Or do we keep walking, keep loving, keep serving, trusting that our emptiness may still be a vessel for His grace? Her story is also a reminder of the divine paradox, that God often hides in the places we least expect, in the face of a starving child, in the touch of a dying beggar, in the silence of prayer unanswered. God was not absent in her life. He was disguised, and she, even in her blindness, recognized Him again and again in the broken bodies she cradled. But her life also challenges us in uncomfortable ways. Do we accept suffering as a mystery to be embraced, or do we fight to end it? Do we see the poor as burdens, or as Christ Himself? Do we spend our lives chasing comfort, while holiness waits for us in costly love? For all her flaws, for all the debates around her choices, Mother Teresa leaves us with one unshakable truth. Love is never wasted. No act of tenderness is too small. No hand held in the dark is forgotten. She once said, Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. Perhaps that is the purest legacy she leaves behind. Not to copy her exactly, not to wear her sari or walk her streets, but to find in our own lives the poor, the lonely, the forgotten, and to love them with the same stubbornness. So what about us? Who are the forgotten ones in our neighborhoods, our families, our cities? Who is waiting for us to bend low and whisper, "You are not forgotten"? And will we recognize them as blessings or walk past them as burdens? Mother Teresa's story does not end in marble statues or titles of sainthood. It ends in the quiet question that lingers at every fireside tonight. What will you do with the silence? What will you do with the thirst? Because in the end, perhaps God does not ask us to feel him. Perhaps he only asks us to be faithful. And if a frail woman in Calcutta could carry the silence for 50 years and still love the world, then maybe, just maybe, we can love through our own darkness too. So tonight, as the fire crackles low and shadows dance on the walls, we are left with the story of a woman who walked through both light and darkness and chose love every step of the way. Mother Teresa was not perfect. She was not always radiant with faith. She did not live in constant joy or certainty. Instead, she lived with questions, with silence, with emptiness. And yet, she kept loving. That is the mystery. That is the miracle. She showed us that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to keep walking through it. She showed us that holiness is not comfort, but sacrifice. She showed us that God's silence is not his absence. It is an invitation to deeper love. Her life raises questions we cannot ignore. What would we do if God felt far away for years? Would we quit? Or would we cling tighter? Do we recognize the poor, the sick, the forgotten as Christ in disguise? Or do we walk past, convincing ourselves someone else will care? Do we mistake greatness for applause? Or do we see it in the quiet hands that wash wounds, feed strangers, and cradle the dying? These are not just questions about Mother Teresa. They are questions about us. Because the world still thirsts, children still cry, the poor still wait, and God is still hidden in the places we do not want to look. So perhaps her legacy is not meant to end with her canonization, or with the stories told about her. Perhaps her legacy is meant to continue in every person who chooses to love when it costs them something, in every soul who keeps faith when heaven is silent, in every listener here tonight who decides that they too will whisper to someone forgotten, "You are not alone." And so, as our fireside fades to embers, let us carry her lesson with us. Not all of us can do great things, but each of us can do small things with great love. Thank you for being part of this circle tonight, for listening, for opening your heart to the story of Mother Teresa. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us. Good night, and may the silence you face in your own life become one day the place where God's whisper is heard most clearly.